Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we are attempting to answer the question of when will Tesla be added to the S&P 500 index. As we know, with Tesla's second quarter results, the company posted a GAAP profit for the quarter as well as for the trailing 12 months for the first time. So that was the last guideline for inclusion in the S&P 500 index that Tesla had not yet met. At the end of the day though, those are just guidelines. The final decision is made by the S&P 500 Index Selection Committee. They have the discretion to change their guidelines at any time, or to include or not include any company, even if it doesn't necessarily fit with those guidelines. The guidelines are there for a reason though, of course, so most of the time the decisions do conform to them. There is no guarantee though that Tesla would be added. For example, the S&P 500 committee might decide that they don't like the amount of regulatory credits that are helping Tesla be profitable at this point in time. So perhaps the committee would be more comfortable delaying inclusion until Tesla posts a 12-month period of profit without those regulatory credit sales. Unfortunately, no way for us to know that ahead of time, but the reason that people care so much about the possible inclusion is because when and if Tesla is included in the index, that should mean that the roughly $4.6 trillion in assets under management that track the performance of the index would likely need to buy about 26 million shares of Tesla stock, which is significant. That's about 17% of the float share count, or the share count that is not locked up by insiders that are unlikely to sell. So with that background out of the way, let's assume the S&P 500 committee does decide to add Tesla based on their second quarter results, and let's look at the history of changes made to the index to hopefully get a better understanding of the timing. So what I have done, with the help of a few incredibly helpful, amazing Twitter followers, is looked back at every company that has been added to the index since 2017. It's about 77 different companies, and then I looked at a few dates for each of these companies. The date the inclusion in the index was first announced by the S&P, the date the inclusion actually happened, and then the last earnings report before that inclusion, as well as the last 10Q or 10K filing with the SEC before inclusion as well. Having these dates allows us to measure the time between them, for example, from announcement to inclusion, or from the final earnings report to the announcement, so we can number one, look for trends, and number two, see if there is anything we can apply to Tesla. What makes this analysis a bit more tricky is because not every company is being added under the circumstances that Tesla hopes to be added, where the company has just turned profitable for the first time. In fact, that's actually incredibly rare. If we go back to the beginning of 2017, I was only able to find 2 other companies that had been added to the index after their most recent quarter had shown profitability for that quarter, as well as for the trailing 12 months for the first time. Those 2 companies were ServiceNow and Twitter, so keep that in mind throughout this analysis, and we will come back to that idea. In general, most companies seem to be added because of their increasing market capitalizations, which I think makes sense because the S&P 500 index is a large cap index, and the minimum market cap guideline for inclusion is about $8 billion. Despite what we have seen in the markets recently with companies like Nikola, for example, there just aren't tons of companies out there that have that size of market cap without any profits. Anyway, getting back to the timing, of these 77 companies, a few of them were added to the index because of mergers or spin-offs, so they didn't necessarily have a prior earnings report before inclusion. Excluding those handful of companies, if we look at the average number of days from the last earnings report to announcement of inclusion in the index, for these companies, it was 43 days. Similarly, from the last filing, the 10Q or the 10K, that average was 39 days because in general, those filings come a few days after the earnings report. So that 43-day average isn't too different than what you would get if you were to just randomly assign the numbers, because companies report earnings 4 times a year. That means on average they're reporting every 91 days. So just throwing random dates in here would get you an average of 45.5 versus what we saw of 43, though it is a bit earlier from the last filing. If we do break those down into buckets, where we have 0 to 10 days, 11 to 20 days, 21 to 30 days, etc., you can start to see here a little bit of that earlier bias, but whether it's less than 10 days or 51 to 60 days, those buckets don't seem to have statistically significant variances. If we look at just ServiceNow and Twitter, their announcements came 25 days and 32 days respectively after their 10Q filing. Tesla reported their second quarter earnings on July 22nd, the 10Q was filed on the 28th, so it has now been, as of August 8th, 11 days since that filing and 17 days since earnings. So while based on past filings, it seems equally likely that Tesla would fall into that 0 to 10 bucket as 51 to 60 days bucket. For example, only 15% of inclusions happen within the first 10 days of that filing. So 85% of announcements, including both ServiceNow and Twitter, have fallen beyond that first 10-day window from the last 10Q or 10K filing. If we look at the averages for Twitter and ServiceNow, between the two, it's about 28 days from the last filing. If we apply that to Tesla, that would imply the inclusion announcement happening on August 25th. I cannot emphasize enough though how little data we have to go on here with just those two examples and the questionable relevance of the rest of the data here. If we do decide to apply that overall average, that was 39 days from the last filing to announcement, that would imply a September 5th announcement for Tesla. I think the definitive conclusion that we can make here is that just because Tesla has not been added yet, doesn't mean they won't be added somewhat soon, and that any expectations for Tesla to have already been added by this point were probably just based on personal expectations and thoughts rather than analysis. The other misconception that I've been seeing out there a lot is that Tesla will be added when the S&P 500 committee meets in September for their quarterly rebalancing. This is definitely not a requirement from the S&P committee. As we can see, there are companies added or deleted pretty much every month. And in the case of ServiceNow, they were added in November. Twitter was added in early June, actually before their June quarterly rebalancing meeting. So there's definitely no certainty that the S&P committee would wait until that quarterly rebalancing to add Tesla. But that also doesn't mean that they wouldn't wait, just that they don't have to. In the case of Tesla, because the market cap is so significant, it might actually make sense to wait for that rebalancing because of the relatively large size that Tesla will be in the index once it is included. If we do look back at the month that announcements are made, we do have an outsized portion in March and June. Strangely enough though, in September and December, not really the same case. From the beginning of 2017 through the end of 2019, there were 6 announcements made in the months of July, 5 in August, 5 in September, and then 3 in October, 6 in November, and 7 in December. So in Tesla's case, maybe a bit more likely to happen in September, but definitely not a guarantee, could happen earlier. In terms of the day of the week, I thought this was pretty interesting. I've seen people say it's going to be Monday or Wednesday. I looked back and it's actually pretty consistent day of the week. Tuesday is the least with 12 announcements over the last 3 years, and then Friday is actually the most probable with 18, but the other days are close. Monday's at 17, Wednesday at 14, Thursday at 16. So it really could happen any day, but not on the weekends. As for time of day, the S&P generally announces the changes to the indices at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time or 2:15 p.m. Pacific Time, but they have on occasion announced things later than that. For example, on June 12th of this year, which was a Friday, they announced the addition of 3 new companies into the S&P 500 at 8:56 p.m. Eastern Time. The last thing on timing is the number of days from announcement to the actual inclusion in the index. That has ranged anywhere from 1 to 10 days over the last 3.5 years, with the average being 6.4 days, the median being 7, with 7 definitely being the most common number of days, with 24 different occurrences over this time, versus 6 days, which was second most frequent, with 13 occurrences. So from there, I think the question that everyone has is, okay, what has the stock price done for these companies that have been included? There's a lot of research out there on this. I don't want to go too deep on it, but just for our sake today, we'll look at how these stock prices changed from the announcement of inclusion to actual inclusion, compared to what the S&P performance was for that period of time, and then the same performance comparison from the last earnings report before inclusion to the actual inclusion. We'll start with that last one, so earnings to inclusion, and as a reminder, there were an average of 43 days in this period, though in some cases up to even 90 plus days. So a lot of variance ranging to an outperform of the S&P 500 index by 44% or an underperformance by 16%. But the average price appreciation here for these stocks was 6.3% over whatever period of time they had, versus the S&P 500 was about 1.8%. So prior to inclusion, from their last earnings report, on average they outperformed the S&P 500 by 4.5%. The median was a bit lower at 2.6%. So either way, some overperformance, but not necessarily huge. So then looking at performance from the announcement to the actual inclusion, generally about a week, the average return for these stocks over that week was an average of 0.0%, with the median actually being negative 0.1%. Over these periods, the S&P 500 actually had a slightly positive return on average, 0.3% positive, with the median being 0.4% positive. So the average variance here was negative 0.3%. The median variance was negative 0.5%. So the week of inclusion, these stocks actually underperformed the S&P index. If we look just at the more comparable cases of ServiceNow and Twitter, over the period from earnings to inclusion, ServiceNow outperformed the S&P by about 24%, Twitter by about 29%, and then from announcement to actual inclusion, which was 2 days and 3 days for these companies respectively, the variance to the performance was plus 1% for ServiceNow and plus 4% for Twitter. So they definitely performed a bit better, but a lot of the gains happened from earnings to the announcement rather than from the announcement to inclusion. Of course, you could continue to analyze this for whatever period of time after inclusion, but probably a bit outside the scope of today's episode. But hopefully this was valuable for you. If you do want to help support independent research, the only way I'm able to do this is with the support I receive from listeners on patreon.com. And it's actually less than 2% of our subscribers that make that possible for everybody else. So if you want to join that group and help support, you can find more details about doing that at patreon.com/Tesla Daily Podcast. Other than that, again, huge thank you to those of you on Twitter that helped me out with this. It was a ton of work going through all those dates and then going through the filings to figure out if the company had been profitable before. That's why today's episode is coming out on Saturday instead of Friday. So I really appreciate the help with that. But that'll wrap it up. As always, huge thank you for listening. Have a good rest of your weekend. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up for notifications. And I'll see you on Monday for the August 10th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.